Hello, here we are for another Chat It On episode. This time we are with Gale. He's one of the men that everyone in the startup ecosystem should know. And better than I to present him, I think he can present himself and show us why he should be one of the people that everyone should know on the startup ecosystem in Portugal and Europe. John?
Oh, thank you, Fernando, and thank you for inviting me here. So my last job in what some people think of as the real world was as a vice president in a merger and acquisition unit that was part of Thomson, what is now Thomson Reuters. And so we bought some startups. We founded a couple. So I was on the founding board of directors of a engineering software B2B startup in Houston. And then I decided to become a consultant. So I've been a consultant for a little more than 20 years. And that started out with me working for the Fortune 500, but I really got more interested in startups. So I started working with startups and spent the last 20 years doing that. So in the course of that, I've co-founded a couple. I've been VP of Business Development of a couple. I've been on the board of directors of the Silicon Valley Association of Startup Entrepreneurs, the Silicon Valley Engineering Council, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers Consultants Network of Silicon Valley. And I've worked with startups all the way from one founder up through the IPO night parties and the acquisition exits. And when you're talking about how do we risk our options as we go into this acquisition, and what's the purchasing CFO really going to do about the options that we own. Along in there, I've worked with a lot of startups, probably talked with thousands and worked with hundreds. And so that's probably enough about me. If you're interested, you can contact Fernando and he'll give you a copy of my white paper on how to prepare a presentation for early stage investors.
And this brings us to the first question. And how should we prepare a project or an idea for a startup to go through a successful pathway during its life cycle?
Okay, great. So let me talk about what the strongest startups in Silicon Valley do. And not every startup in Silicon Valley does this. Not every startup outside of Silicon Valley can do this. But the more of these things that you can do, the better off you are. So several years before you're going to be a startup, what you do is you start talking with friends of your parents, your friends of yours who are in the startup space, and you get to know how things work. And then what you do is you start to meet investors, so you get to know how those things work. Then maybe, say 3 years before you're going to want to have money in your bank account for your startup, you start making a serious attempt to get to know investors and how they think. And then as you're noodling through what kind of startup you want to start, you think about all the things that you can do before you form the corporate entity, because no sense in spending that money until you need to. And basically you can do everything except money. So you can develop an MVP, you can talk to customers about what they want, you can discover the market pains, you can do everything except have people pay you for that MVP. And then you can, of course, can form the startup overnight if you need to have a corporate entity in place. And you also can be talking more to potential investors. So now let's assume that you formed your startup and now you're working on things and you think, okay, 9 months from now, I'm going to need some money. So what I want to do is I want to start getting all of the advisors in place that I need to have, because early stage investors want you to have those advisors. You want to start following those advice, so you're going to look sophisticated, when you get to the investors. Then maybe 6 months ahead of when you want to receive the money, you start seriously talking to investors. You give them a very brief presentation and you say, this is the sort of thing I'm working on. I need money in 6 months. I'm going to come back in maybe 3 months and want to start raising money. And so I'd like to know if I should come back to you and what sort of things you'd like me to bring with me if I did that. And the investor says, well, let's assume he's interested in your space. He says, yes, I do invest in your space. I understand it well. I can give you good advice there. And what I want you to do is bring me evidence of your market traction, which means I want you to have paying customers because I want to go talk to those paying customers. And so if he or she likes what you're doing, then he's probably going to start talking to you faster. The investor likes to have a very relaxed conversation with you. He doesn't want to try to do this in a rush. He's not going to do it in a rush. So if he has to do it in a rush to do it with you, he won't do it with you. So he's going to start having a relaxed conversation, he or she is going to start having a relaxed conversation with you if they're interested. And then you're going to succeed in raising the money a little faster. Now, when you actually get to the point where you're sitting there with the investor, and by the way, you are introduced to the investor by somebody who knows your startup well, who knows the investor well. The investor trusts that intermediary because that's one of his key criteria for how he invests. So you're sitting there talking, and he's or she is very interested in the balanced team that you have. And when I say balanced team, that means you've got some sort of sales or business development capability, you've got a marketing capability, you've got business capability. You probably don't have a financial person or a COO because you don't need them that early. But if you don't have anybody with sales skills, you're probably never going to get enough market traction in order to be able to get to the point of talking to that investor. That team ideally has experience launching new products in the target market that you're now addressing. Now remember, no startup has everything that I've just described or will continue to describe, but the more of those things you have, the better off you have.
Yeah, and because that's the optimized situation, the best case scenario that you are presenting, right? Because we are listening, I was listening to you, and it was coming to my mind a lot of names of startups that are succeeding or succeeded, and we saw that some of them was one-man show during a lot of time, and the others were just bringing on the team people that were key essential by the time they started getting some funds. But from what I understood, and really what is really important on this is the trust, right? The capability of creating a project that has a good sense or a good idea, but the trust that you can get it from the VC that can come and invest on your idea and your project, and the way that you are planning to make him or make her consider your project and your startup. Isn't that so?
The VC and you both need to trust each other, and whether or not the VC trusts you is going to depend on how you articulate what you've done and how many of those things that I mentioned you've done well. The more that you do well, the better off you are. Now, it's very important that you trust the VC, which means that you are going to talk to startup CEOs that he or she has previously invested in, and you're going to find out what they say about that experience. Mm-hmm. And your level of trust there is going to depend a lot on that. Remember that it's easier to get a divorce than to get rid of an investor. And so you really need to be comfortable spending a lot of time where this other person has a lot of ability to tell you what to do for the next 5, 7, 10 years, 15, 20 years if you're in biotech or pharma.
Okay. And this is something that is transversal to all the activity sectors, right? These guidelines, as you talked now about 2 or 3 of them.
Well, yes, but it sort of works in the following way. If you're trying to sell a startup which you want to represent as being world class, which is going to be another Facebook, then the demands on you are higher. If you're going to get the very best investors. If, on the other hand, you're going to just try to do something that's, say, pan-European, then the expectations of you are a little lower. And if you're going to do something that is only going to work within a country or just in one city, the expectations of you and your team get lower and lower, and the quality of the investors that you attract are lower and lower. So in Silicon Valley, the very best angel investors work like 60 hours a week, and they really know what they're doing, and they won't invest in a startup that has a previous investment from somebody that they perceive as not being a professional business angel. As you get outside of that to places far away ideologically and otherwise, say San Francisco, which is an hour and a half away and very far away in many ways, then life is a little different. For example, I know a litigation attorney in San Francisco who is an angel investor. He's a very, very good businessman, but he probably doesn't know anything about your target sector. He probably doesn't have any ability to introduce you to the people you need to meet in order to do what you need to do in order to get to the next level. And he probably doesn't have the ability to introduce you to the next round of investors that you need at the next level. So he doesn't meet the criteria of the very best investors.
So besides having the qualities and the setup that a startup should have to attract the investors, it's mandatory that they have critical sense to evaluate correctly the VCs and the investors that might come to their door, and see if they also are the right investors, not only for that moment because they have money, but also to escalate for the next stages, not the next stage, but to the other rounds after the next stage, right?
Yes, that's very true. And that's one of the reasons why you want to start talking to investors a few years ahead of time, because you need to know how they think. You want to be able to talk comfortably with them. You want to be comfortable presenting yourself as an equal because you have a valuable property. You have a valuable startup. They have money and knowledge, and you want to bring this together to make something that's going to be very successful. So you both are bringing value to the table, and you both need to do that with respect for the other person. Otherwise, you shouldn't do it.
Okay. So now let's focus on just one part of the life of a startup. That is the way they brand it themselves. How should a startup should brand itself and market itself to help attracting the best and the better investors to its project? It should be only having a cool website, or should they go to all the roundups of one thing that I call it the startup circus and go to all the events that exist for pitching and pitching and pitching until finding the queen, the queen of all the angels to invest on their project? Or should they be more criterious and being focused on product marketing and focused on their services or products and mark them on those areas?
Well, I recommend that they stay away from these startup showcase events where there's lots of people. What that does is tell all your competition and all of the investors in the competition what you're doing.
Yeah.
Many startups in Silicon Valley do a stealthy mode. So for example, I had a contract with a major semiconductor, a venture capital firm within a major semiconductor company for 5 years. And one of the startups that came to me during that time said, "We've been very stealthy. You are the first person who's heard our presentation." And so I took them into the semiconductor company, and they really like that. They like to hear about things that nobody else knows about. And so, ultimately they didn't do a deal, but the company that I had as a client did something to help them meet somebody else who was more interested in them, because the investors all know each other and they share information with people because they've got long-term relationships there. I was at a conference. I met another startup CEO, and we had sort of a conversation where he didn't tell me very much, but he was trying to find out what I knew. And he said, well, why don't you come visit us? And here's our address. And he gives me a business card which doesn't have any company name on it. All it's got is his name and address. And so I go there at the time, and there's no sign on the building. So I ring the doorbell, and a woman says yes. And so I say who I am, and then I'm to see so-and-so. And she says, okay, I'll come get you. So she gets me, takes me into a conference room. So I'm totally outside of where the company is. I haven't seen anything except walls and a conference room, which has nothing in it. And so then the guy comes in and sits down, and we have a conversation for a couple hours. And then he said, well, gee, seems like you know interesting things. We'd like to have you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then we'll talk about what we're doing. That's, the sort of thing that a stealthy startup does. Mm-hmm. Now, what the startup really needs to do to attract investors is they need to have market traction, which means paying customers. It's very difficult to get investors prior to having paying customers. And if you're sitting there establishing traction in your vertical market sector, and nobody knows anything about you except that vertical market sector, and you're satisfying mission critical needs for companies in that growth sector, then guess what? The investors are going to come find you because they invest in that sector, and that's exactly what you want as an investor who invests in that sector. And so he's going to find out about you, or she, and they're going to come visit you and talk to you. And you can, then know that there's a reason for you to be together. Both of you know that there's a reason for you to be together. So typically, early stage startups don't spend a lot of time worrying about branding. After they've got maybe their second angel round of investment, then they'll spend some money on branding and the fancy marketing things and so forth. But they're probably going to change their company name at that point. So the company name at the beginning doesn't really matter, because you haven't gone through all of those marketing things you go through to pick a good company name. You're just trying to get started and see if you have something that satisfies a mission critical need in a growth sector, and that generates paying customers. And if you can, the money follows the happy paying customers.
So you're going to focus the resources on what is really needed, and after that you start composing and closing the gaps that might exist, like the name, the branding that you need to develop, collaterals that you need to develop to support the communication that you need to do with your market and with the VCs and so on. Is that so?
Yeah, right. So for example, I was hired as VP of business development of a startup. I founded the business development function for the startup. And so the CEO says, you're not going to get any help from the marketing people because they're busy helping sales. So anything you need for marketing collateral, create it yourself. And so I threw together something that seemed like it would work. I went out and did some calls, and I refined that a lot over the first, say, 10 calls. And then I had something that was good enough to go close the first deals. And so I closed the first deals for the company. Now, 2 years later, the company was closing deals in a much more sophisticated way with beautiful marketing literature and so forth. But, that was a different time.
No, but it's important to bring that experience, because from my experience and also from yours, of course, you can see it nowadays that most of the companies that are starting up, they are focusing on the branding, and they are so focused on branding that they sometimes they forget to present to the market what they do.
Yeah, and
or how they do it.
That's an example of a startup where they haven't done their homework on getting to know how things work beforehand, and they haven't brought in advisors who know how things work. I mean, you would rather not have advisors who've only been involved in, say, one startup. You want advisors who've been involved in, at least a dozen, preferably more, because they've got a better worldview about how everything works. And they can tell you war stories about whatever situation you're asking them about, so that you can understand how things, work in the real world. And you need to develop a trust relationship with whatever advisors you bring on board, and you need to, follow their advice, or there's no point in having them there. Now, so for example, if you're a hardware startup, one of the things you want to do early is you want to get some strategic IP advice, because you want to know whether or not you're going to file provisional patents. Now, you're probably not going to file provisional patents until either just before or just after the first angel round, but it depends on what you're doing, and you need advice from somebody who knows more than you do. You certainly don't want to start paying for a complete patent, because that's going to cost you $30,000, and start a train that'll cost you $100,000. And you want to be sure you're walking down the right path before you do that.
Thank you, John, because you already gave us a great view of how should a startup start. It's funny when we are saying this way, but it's good to have your vision as someone that is in the market for a long time and is already worked with hundreds of startups, where you saw the good and the bad thing happen to all of them. And it's always interesting to have this experience brought by someone like you to show us what is really relevant to make the job done correctly and to make a successful startup. Thank you once again.
Oh, and thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
Thank you.